townhouse developments, you'll often encounter the issue of tandem parking. Most residential parking standards prohibit tandem parking, parking one behind the other. They have to be side by side. Sometimes, again, in townhouse developments, you can get that waived. If there's a garage, you can tandem park, of course, behind the garage, you know, in the outside. But these are the way that parking requirements, and it's more of an issue in a commercial, non-residential setting than it is with residential, because the parking requirements have increased over time. In a shopping center, you can find two different scenarios. The code can provide that in a shopping center, there's a uniform shopping center rate, and it doesn't matter what goes in the shopping center. Some of them you have to park by the specific uses. So every time a tenant changes, the city's going to make you recalculate the parking. Doesn't that just give you a headache to think about it? Right. And it's because they don't want too many restaurants, or they don't want too many of the intense uses. So they want to control them again. But you have to look for that in a commercial multi-user project. What parking ratios are going to apply to this? And if I'm redeveloping something, how behind the 8 ball am I? How deep in the hole on parking am I to start with, and how can I solve it? In this urban setting where parking requirements will often be reduced, and you're going to handle your parking by structured parking, which is great because it gives you control over the parking you're going to provide without regard to the surface area that you want to consume of your site for parking, right? You can build, if you have enough money, you can build as much structured parking as you might need. So you, as a developer, would take control of that. But the cities in these urban areas, they don't like ugly garages. Okay, they might like garages, and people in downtown, people in South Florida might like garages because it gets them out of the sun and the rain, but they don't like ugly garages. So what are they going to do? They're going to say that you have to spruce up your garage, either by architectural features or what is now called an active liner. Doesn't that sound interesting? Do you know what an active liner is on a garage? No, it's actually ground floor retail, ground floor commercial. The garage gets wrapped in another use that has people coming and going and looks nicer. It doesn't look like a blank.
Active liners, right?
Active liners.
As a matter of fact, in Fort Lauderdale, I think what they're doing now is having residential units wrap around the garage. So you're seeing the windows for the units rather than the garage.
Trying to figure out how to quiet. Oh, there it is. A series of texts that I don't want right now. And
the styles probably
do not disturb.
They wrap.
Do not disturb.
Residential units around the garage, yes.
Oh, I could silent the whole phone. Yeah. But I just hit do not disturb on the whole multiple user text message string. So they're all responding to each other, and it's binging at me every time somebody else that chimes in on the conversation. I'm like, oh. Okay, sorry. There was something else going on over here.
We were talking about the wrap.
The wrap of
Yeah, we looked at the Styles Project multifamily, and they were showing us how I had a wrap on it. Yes.
So in the forward-thinking urban design world, having an active liner. Now, if they can't really put uses around the garage, architectural softening features, landscaping akin to window boxes and things like that will be used to soften the impact of a garage. So they'll like the garage, but they won't want your ugly garage. That's really the bottom line. Location of parking. The other regulations that you're going to encounter are the design of the parking lot itself, landscape in the parking lot, wheel stops, landscaping between the lanes, landscape islands at the ends of the lanes of parking, the number of trees, the setback, the buffering, all of these things. It's like you thought you were designing a project, and in reality, you were kind of designing a project and you were really designing a parking lot.
Ventilation.
Well, mean, in a structured garage, but that's a building code issue, so.
Yeah, in Miami, we're starting to realize serious problems in downtown, certainly in the Brickell area with loading and unloading. These beer trucks, for example, that deliver beer between 8 and say 10 o'clock in the morning for the various restaurants and bars are taking away lanes from traffic during peak time. What new techniques or measures or considerations are evolving to take care of that problem?
Well, most of these city codes have not just parking requirements, but loading requirements. And they have dimensions for the loading zones, and they have standards for where the loading zones have to be located. So if they don't have loading zones, first of all, it might be happening because they get too many trucks. They have 2 loading zones and they have 3 trucks coming at the same time. And I don't know, do you want to build 3 loading zones for the one occasion every week when you might have 3 trucks instead of 2? I would push back on that if I was the developers council. Say, really, how often are we going to have 3 trucks instead of 2? Your code says 2 loading zones, that's what I'll give you. I'm not going to give you 3 just because the guy next door didn't plan his deliveries right. He sometimes has 3. That's the battle. But the location of the parking can also be an issue. There's usually a minimum, like there has to be a walkability factor between your parking lot and your use. If you try to solve a parking deficiency by off-site parking, that's when that range, that walkability range is going to come into effect. Active learners, increase in parking. So, as we were talking about, this is a common cause of nonconformities. And in an older city where it's a recurring problem, like if you look at the city, the nonconforming, the parking regulations in the city of Fort Lauderdale, they have pages of regulations on dealing with non-conforming parking because it's such a common issue. So they have a whole different set of thresholds. They have thresholds for how much you can change a non-conforming use before you lose the non-conforming status, how much you can change a parking lot, a non-conforming parking lot. They have a whole other set of standards just for parking non-conformities. That's why I call it the tail that wags the dog. Any other questions on this?
Are the handicap spaces included in the parking ratio?
Typically, yes, they're included. You'll have to meet the parking ratio and also meet within the parking ratio, within that total parking, the handicap requirements.
Is that specified by the city or is that ADA compliance?
Typically it's by reference to the building code, which incorporates the ADA requirements. So I'm just looking ahead where we are here. I want to stop, one more thing about parking is what you can do when you have a parking deficiency. How can you solve it? Or when there is a parking requirement that you believe is not really necessary. Okay, they're asking you to park for Christmas Eve. When most of the time, at a shopping center, where most of the time you don't need all that parking. How many times do you drive by a mall and there are just a sea of unused parking in those parking lots? So you want to reduce your parking requirement in some way. And so let's talk a little bit about how you sometimes can do that. Now the city's own code has to allow it. We're going to talk about variances this afternoon. You can seek the parking variance, but sometimes the city codes will allow parking reductions that they don't have the negative connotation that a variance would have. It's a more technical analysis, and if you convince them based on a study that your project can operate adequately with a reduced number of parking spaces, they'll sometimes grant that administratively or as part of your development approval. So it's, and mostly, architects can do these studies, but usually I get a traffic engineer. And they analyze, they go to the standards in this industry, you know, the International Transportation, the ITE manual, is that what it stands for? International Society of Traffic Engineers or something. There's an ITE manual that collects all the data on parking requirements for different uses. So you can have a traffic engineer do a study to try to support your contention that you can get by with fewer parking and operate just fine. And sometimes convince a city that they can reduce the parking requirements for your project without any harm. It's always, again, it's always an issue with your neighbors because it's the thing that they can count and it's what they see as the mechanism to oppose your development if they don't like your development. But if you go in with a well-crafted traffic engineering study or parking reduction study, you're in pretty good shape. You can usually reduce the parking standards with that kind of study. I'm trying to think of an example. For a long time, the city of Fort Lauderdale had a hotel parking requirement that didn't make a lot of sense on the beach. And it wasn't because it was on the beach, but because the beach hotels were destinations. So folks, international, national visitors, they flew in and they took a taxi to their resort on the beach and they didn't need a parking space because that's why they were going to the beach, right? So it was kind of a long process to convince the city that the parking standards for a suburban hotel or one out by the interstate shouldn't be the same standards for hotels on the beach where it's primarily a destination, a resort destination hotel. It took a lot of parking studies funded by a lot of developers to start convincing them that that was the case. And the parking study would involve a study of utilization. How many spaces are actually used at different times of the week and different times of the year, peak season and off-peak season. And they would apply provisions from the ITE manual to say that the standard can be reduced and we're still going to meet the demands of this type of hotel. So it's kind of fun. For someone who doesn't like math, it was kind of fun to do parking reduction studies. Another basis for doing parking reduction studies will be shared parking or kind of complementary uses. When a commercial development includes a use that primarily functions during the day and one that primarily functions at night, you can get a shared parking analysis because they're not all going to be there at the same time using the same spaces. I'm working on a project now where my client has data from his other projects to show this is the guy with the office uses and the small self-storage uses all in the same building. He has data from his other projects that show how many of his office tenants also use the self-storage. Now, there's nothing in the ITE about that because nobody else has ever combined these uses before. But he has data that 60% of his office tenants also take one of the storage units. So we can start dropping those storage units out of the parking calculation. And we can adjust it by some figure to make it reasonable, to make it cover multiple scenarios. But that's going to be one of the bases that we go in and ask for parking reduction because he's combining these uses that can share parking and he has data to support it. All right? So you can structure your parking. Go ahead.
In extreme cases, do they use valets and leased land to reduce it by saying, I'm going to park half my cars over here?
Yes, all of those things are strategies also. The resort hotels that we talked about, they vary, and some condominiums will greatly reduce the amount of parking that they provide by entering into a contract with the city that says it's going to be 100% valet. And valet parking, as we know, and how many of you ever did valet parking in college or something like that to earn money? So they park them nose to tail, and they can park many more cars in the same space on a valet basis. And off-site parking, again, usually a city is going to require that you prove to them that you have that parking secured, that it's not an itinerant or informal arrangement, that they can count on it, and that if you're going to let it go, you got to come ask them. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a good example of that parking arrangement in the mall in Miami where it was just been repurposed. And they have a lot of stores and there's a lot of customers during the daytime. And then they also have a lot of restaurants. And when the stores are starting to close, the restaurant people are coming in and there's a little bit of an overlap of maybe about an hour where there may be some parking challenges. But once the stores are closed and the restaurants, customers just fill that parking lot.
Yep.
So,
Okay, and other parking strategies that I've seen come out of, innovative things developers are doing to deal with parking. We're starting to at least see some plans approved for underground parking, which in South Florida seems crazy to me because you're gonna hit the water. So it's an engineering challenge, but it can be done and it is being done so that the developers can provide structured parking, not have as much of an eyesore to deal with above ground, and preserve their height for what they really want, which are their condo units or their office space.
right.
So we're seeing them be willing to put the engineering and the construction costs into underground parking in South Florida when we haven't seen, it's just never been worth the money down here before. We had acres of land to have surface parking, and now it's becoming constrained. Another thing is mechanical parking. I have written provisions of city codes to allow mechanical parking, and I haven't actually seen it go in anywhere. Does anybody have experience
Yes.
where mechanical actually exists?
Yeah, they have an elevator type facility where,
Porsche Tower.
yeah, exactly. And they just jack one car on top of the other.
Now,
They're lifting the cars up to the condo units.
is it operated by the driver or by an operating management company?
Well, there's a condominium right next to where I live and they have both. So the valet, it's operated by the valet operator and they can just stack cars like crazy. And then the condominium owners who have multiple spaces, they have a key in a facility where they can use their own elevator to park 2 cars.
Really?
Yeah.
And the one
Okay.
I'm looking at in Sunny Isles, it actually takes your car up to your living. So your garage is next to your condo, essentially outside your living room. So it's really.
That's a real high-end condo. That's a real high-end condo, right?
Yeah, they started
It's not
trying
a
to
Porsche, so you gotta have a Porsche.
Well, I think that as the city governments become accustomed to it, as the management companies become accustomed to it, and the pricing will become more manageable, I think we'll see more mechanical parking.
Yeah.
And I'm dealing with it. I'm negotiating a project that we're tussling over whether my client is supposed to get 400 parking spaces, and we're tussling over whether the developer can substitute some number of mechanical and valet spaces for it. So, and it's hard. It's until you have experience with it, there's a lot of unknowns. So, but it's another way in which project developers try to address parking deficiencies. Sometimes you can exchange parking for an enhanced bus stop if you're on a bus line or something like that. So the city will be willing to give up on-site parking if they believe that you're going to actually be able to create more synergy with mass transit or something like that.
What I'm not sure about is if there's a power outage and you have that kind of parking, how do you get that car you need?
Yeah,
It's a long walk.
I bet those facilities have pretty significant generator systems, because even office towers now that have been built since under the new code, they all have pretty significant generation. When Wilma hit here, our firm kept trying to get us, come to the office, we have power. Come, Bill. Work, Bill. Don't stay home in your dark house, come to work. We have power. Anyway, again, not that I'm cynical or anything. Oh, right. I want okay, another nitty-gritty thing you encounter when you're dealing with project approvals and entitlement are architectural and design reviews. Let's think back to our first discussion about zoning and how zoning is valid. Okay, it's based on what exercise of power by the local government.
Police.
Police power. What's the police power? It's the right to do what? It's the power to do what?
Regulate an area for the benefit of the community.
The public health, safety, and welfare.
Yeah.
Yeah. So zoning was upheld initially because finally it was determined that it wasn't, as long as it was reasonable, it wasn't an improper infringement on private property rights, but it was an exercise of the police power. And one of the questions back then was aesthetic type of regulations and non-essential, what some would call non-essential things like parks. Could zoning regulations be enforced to simply protect the beauty of the community? Was that a good enough reason to restrict someone's property rights?
Yes.
And it is.
Property value.
It is. Aesthetic. So that leads us to what is a fairly recent in terms of the history of zoning. The earliest zoning regulations did not concern themselves with architecture or design. It was just uses. Is it a store? Is it a manufacturing facility? Is it a residence? So the earliest zoning regulations only regulated uses, but eventually they came to start regulating aesthetics. And we started to see architectural and design criteria for projects. Some cities that have a strong character, like has anybody worked in Coral Gables?
Yes.
Right, Coral Gables has really strong architectural standards because they have a certain character associated with their history that they want to preserve. Miami Beach, the mid-century modern Art Deco or whatever, yeah. Okay, so we've encountered that. Other cities that were more suburban and newer, like let's say, Coral Springs was created, probably in the 70s. They tried to protect the aesthetics of their city by really strict sign regulations. One of the things that clutters and detracts from the attractiveness of a commercial corridor can be an overabundance of unregulated and incompatible or conflicting signage. So it was like a big deal back in the 70s when Coral Springs wouldn't let McDonald's put up their golden arches because it violated their sign code. It was like national news. So architectural and design reviews, and then we do see these aesthetic concerns in sign regulations also. And more cities are trying to preserve the character of their cities by doing this. Sometimes they have very specific regulations. You have to have, if the building is more above a certain number of levels, you have to have eyebrows at this level and cornices at that level and a certain percentage of window in any opening, and very specific. Some of them go the route of an architectural review board. So they have an advisory board that they collect of professionals that their job is simply to cast judgment on the aesthetics of your design. The city of Pompano Beach has an architectural review board for that reason. And it's a fearful thing to take your project that might be designed by a nationally known architect and run it through a local architectural review board. And those folks may be awesome architects who are appointed for their skills and their keen sense of judgment and their insight, and they may get appointed because they're friends with an elected official.
Doesn't it become very subjective?
It becomes very subjective, and the criteria are very difficult to manage. So there's a lot of, as a developer's attorney, there's a certain amount of anxiety traipsing into the architectural review board if there are not standards. Now, as that practice goes on, you begin to get a feeling for what they want, and you can search the histories of the projects that have been approved or rejected previously. You can actually talk to the individual board members and find out what's on their mind, and you can get a sense of, we like this, we don't like that. Eventually, sometimes they'll adopt very firm color palettes. The city of Hollywood has a very strict color palette. and they mean business, okay? Yeah.
There in France, there's a famous market, popular market, it's over 200 years old. And they have the mom and pop stores and so forth, many food. And they've been holding McDonald's at bay for multiple years.
Yeah.
And they can't get a store in the area. And because of this, they say they want to maintain a certain look and so forth, preserve the historical. And they've tried, and even though above them would love to bring it in, so they're bringing jobs, they've been successful in keeping McDonald's out.
Yeah, it can happen. Those kinds of policies can be implemented by architecture, design, or signage features, and they can also be done by more substantive regulations, like cities or towns that may want to keep Walmart out. They'll restrict the size of a single user in a commercial setting or something like that. You know, Walmart works around it. They find a way. They have their urban design, I guess, and even Publix. Go downtown Fort Lauderdale, they have an urban design Publix that fit on a smaller site. So they can't always protect it. But let me throw this out there. Do you think that a zoning regulation that blatantly says that in this section, no nationally known brand retailers are permitted, but only locally owned retailers, is that a valid zoning regulation?
No.
Good, glad to hear it.
Yeah.
You're right, it's not. But why?
It's prejudicial. It's discriminatory. Yeah, exactly.
What is
Well,
the nexus
we
with
think-
health and welfare, I would think.
That's it. Is the impact of a McDonald's any different than the impact of some other 2,000 square foot sandwich shop? Is the impact any different? Not really.
You know how McDonald's has the free Wi-Fi and all that, and all of a sudden you walk in there, there's a lot of people just lounging out, hanging out, waiting for the bus, and
Whole different issue.
It's not health, safety, and welfare.
Okay, so there's a community with a historic downtown, and they're trying very hard to protect the character of the downtown, but they can't just say no Starbucks. Because a Starbucks is the same thing as a locally owned coffee shop. So they might try other ways to preserve the ability of the local shop to compete, to get the site, and it might be signage, it might, something else. But in here, I don't think you could make a zoning regulation simply based on the national chain versus the locally owned. But good, very good. All of you honed in on the impact and there being no nexus between treating the two of them differently. There's no impact. Good.
But let me ask a question. Now in the 21st century, with technology evolving and pretty much becoming very dominant, how do you see some of those jurisprudence laws change or be sensitive to the changing or the evolution of technology in dominating society?
Is he the designated punter to suck up time when we're, yeah.
Yeah,
No,
ball's in there.
How do I see, I'm trying to think of examples where changing technology has affected land use regulation.
California, they have the app where you click it and it's based on your GPS. And if I click it, it's kind of like an Uber-ish deal. You could be in your parking spot about to pull out and you'll wait till I pull up. That way I can guarantee the spot.
Okay, so parking management. So technology could be used to apply a higher level of parking management to decrease the overall requirement for parking.
Yeah, Miami
Good
and
example.
Miami Beach is doing that right now. They both have apps that.
Help you find a parking spot?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm trying to think about other uses. You know, technology is allowing more work, more decentralized work, right? Okay, so office, if somebody has a 100,000 square foot office building, it would generate a certain number of parking spaces. Could the ability to work remotely would that be a good argument for the reduction of parking that, that all of the workers in the office building work remotely 2 days a week or something like that to reduce parking? Signage. This is not really all that new, but there are new technologies and signage that allow the type, the face of the sign to change very rapidly with different degrees of brightness and different, and there are places where you supposedly can't change the face of a sign without a permit, but these things change, they can change in an instant with programming. It's not like there's a guy on a ladder taking out the little black letters and putting up the new black letters like there used to be. So maybe the regulation of signage and the content of signage is different now because it can change so rapidly.
Yeah. Times Square run into a problem with that, in that it's known for all the signs and the vibrancy and all that, but to get a certain financial benefit, they allow the street there to fall under the umbrella of a highway. And in so doing, it came in conflict because, for highways going back some decades, they said they didn't want signs to pollute.
The Lady Bird Johnson Act.
Right, to the highways. And so now they have to go back in New York and make some provision that would make an exception to that, because that falls on the highway now, and that the character of Times Square is known for that.
Okay, that's a good point. I'm thinking about, how many of you are familiar with LEED? LEED in building design,
Oh, yeah.
right? Okay,
Leadership in engineering environmental.
right, the utilization of building technologies to reduce the power burden of a building, to reduce the water and sewer needs by using reused water. So we're seeing the availability of LEED design, and we're seeing that hit the zoning codes in many cities where they make it mandatory, honestly. Now they tend to have a threshold of the size of commercial building to which they'll apply that standard, and they don't actually say it has to be LEED. They say it has to be LEED or something like LEED. The U.S. Green Building Council maybe, or something. Yep.
Now here's my question: can the government enforce the non-profit organization code, like the whole stuff with the LEED? There is now a new section in the building code that requires that you meet some energy standard, and can they go one step further and say that you have to meet the LEED criteria? Because I've heard some places where you have to meet LEED criteria, and last time I checked, LEED was a non-profit organization, and I don't really have to conform with non-profit organization. But the question is, can the government force you to do stuff that non-profit organizations put in place?
Well,
If it's in the code.
they can, whether they can or not is irrelevant, because what they can do is require you in your design to meet the same standards that LEED certification would require. So they may say, you don't have to get LEED certified, but your design has to meet the standards for at least LEED certified,
At
silver,
whatever
gold,
category.
whatever, platinum, whatever level they think they can get away with. And it doesn't have to be LEED, and some of them will go so far as to say, you not only have to design and build to meet the standard, but you have to get certified by someone. And we're not saying it has to be LEED. It might be, there are other local government agencies that are coming together to create their own standards that are the equivalent, that they think are the equivalent of LEED. So they don't, and some of them might flat out say, you need to be LEED certified. I don't know really if that's valid or not, but it doesn't matter, because what they could turn around and say is, you have to design to meet the standards of, to meet the energy efficiency standards of LEED or its equivalent, of LEED certified or its equivalent. And I think, what do you think? Do you think that reducing power consumption, the use of potable water, that doing the things that are done in a LEED building, do you think that's a legitimate exercise of the police power?
Yes.
Yes.
I don't disagree. What if the cost, what if the building code still permits you to build without it, and the cost of doing it is 5% increase to the project cost?
Benefits
Is
outweigh
it
the
still
cost.
reasonable? 10%?
Benefits outweigh the cost, and you can demonstrate that.
Yeah.
I might be the wrong person to ask, but because I've worked in for several years, and it is more expensive to build LEED. Nowadays, it's cheaper than what it used to be a few years back.
More
Costs,
products
it's
available.
more competition for starters. There's more to choose from, both in services and also equipment. Like not 5 years ago, you only had like 2 low flow flush toilets. Now you have 25 to choose from, all prices. So when you're building LEED, it's more like if you want to certify, and I recognize it's a pain to go back and forth with the procedure, but if you do it with the standards at the end as a developer, you're gonna get your money back. A lot of, and there's a lot of controversy on this. There are reports like from CBRE for rental of commercial spaces. LEED certified spaces rent faster and more expensive and more higher prices than non-certified. So it's a matter of depends on the project that you're planning to do and how much. What's the difference? Is it 2%, 6%? Certified mostly it has become like a trophy for most cities. You know, saying I have 20 certified buildings in my
Sure.
villa or whatever. But if you want to do it right, and if you want to set a legacy as a developer, I think you should do the right thing. Minimize the building, the footprint of the building. Try to go energy efficient. Reuse the water if you can. If it's not, if it always fits within your cost. And have done a lot of projects and been on both sides, and it does.
And to add on to that, wouldn't it be more beneficial if we had the LEED regulation, the zoning, or like for comprehensive plan for the future as like population continues to increase and we obviously need to conserve energy and water and all those other areas, right?
To put it into place for new projects so that it gets better at least. So
Right.
that the sustainability of development improves.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, some of them apply it to, of course, some of them apply it to new projects. I don't know of a city in Broward County anyway that is applying it to developers will choose to apply it to a renovation project for their own marketing and business purposes, but I don't know of a city that will insist on it. But
Are there tax incentives to kind of hedge against the cost, the additional costs?
it wouldn't surprise me a bit. I would expect there to be, but I really don't know the details of them.
There used to be a lot more. There are not that many. But as of September 2011, I believe, all federal buildings, new federal buildings, have to be LEED certified or green loan, and anything that you remodel over 30% has to be LEED certified by federal regulation.
Well, and you encounter it also with publicly held companies that, like the national banks and some of the national publicly held companies, they have standards. They simply won't take anything other than LEED certified office space. Yeah.
And areas, jurisdictions that are under so much pressure for water, and for example, California, they were requiring existing homeowners to reduce use by as much as 40% and so forth. You could see a justifiable argument
Yes.
to say required this on the part of those.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I mean, it throws risk into your project, because even when you get past the design, right? You commission a design and you have a design in hand that is going to meet LEED certification or LEED Silver or whatever level. But it's based upon the use of a material, and the material becomes unavailable. Or it's based upon the availability of reuse water, but the city gets behind in their capital improvements plan and they don't get the reuse water to your site. Okay? So there are things, if developers could be told this will cost you $5,000, done. But they're told to meet a performance standard, and they can make a plan for meeting it, and they can estimate what the cost of meeting it will be, but it introduces to the project risks that they can't always control. Or it depends on whether their contractor hires a waste disposal firm that actually separates and disposes of the waste properly. And if the records, and you tell me, if the records don't support, then you can't get the points.
Right.
So you lose control when you introduce these performance standards into the development. And that's why there's a certain level of discomfort. And they might want to agree to do it voluntarily in their design, but try to avoid a requirement to actually certify, because then it eliminates some of the things that they can lose control of.
Today is the Gala Verde in Pier 66, where they're gonna award one of the 4 buildings that were chosen as being the best LEED certified building. Now, with my experience with Deerfield Beach, they were aiming for a silver certification of the building, so they did all that you said. They ended up with a gold, so now Deerfield Beach is the pier building is one of the 4 contestants tonight.
Good.
So we're
Congratulations.
just waiting, and that's where I'm heading after we leave here. But it was very easy to accommodate the certification. I think it adds so much prestige to the buildings that if you can do it, any type of LEED certification is great.
Yep, okay. All right, so we've managed to make it to lunch.
Thanks, Doctor.
All right, let's do it. We're done. Thank you. That was a really good night.
So hot turkey food, I'm guessing.
The visitor? What's your name? Noah? What's your background?
That one's a turkey. Good. Yeah. When he said that, I think that's it. It's not gonna say. It doesn't say. Oh. We need. Mayo. It depends on what you got. How do I find the one with the bacon?
Yes, that's what we have to do. And then to allow what you want to do, and then find out what you want to do. Level 1. Yes, but they might say, but only if you have 1 acre lot, more than 1 acre, or less than 1 acre. They might do things, and it or you change the zoning to
They have it there. Maybe a little more less. Yeah, but you don't.
Did you pause it, I hope?